Anyway, that's the end of our shows from Sweden. I hope you've all enjoyed them at home because we've enjoyed them.
It's been great.
Lovely.
In the summer of 1992, two old footballers said goodbye. There were no grand ceremonies, no national mourning, no headlines announcing the end of an era, just two familiar faces and one final farewell. To most viewers, it looked like the end of a television show, but they were wrong. Because what disappeared that day wasn't just St and Greavsie, it was an entire football world. A world of muddy pitches, packed terraces, local heroes, and Saturday afternoons that belonged to the supporters. For nearly a decade, Jimmy Greaves and Ian St John had become the voice of that world. Every week, millions tuned in, not for tactics, not for expert analysis, but for stories, laughter, and two former footballers who spoke like ordinary fans. That was their magic. Watching St and Greavsie didn't feel like television, it felt like football itself. But while supporters laughed along every Saturday, the game was changing, money was growing, television was evolving, and the old football culture was slowly disappearing. By 1992, that change could no longer be stopped. A new era was arriving. The Premier League was about to be born, and the world that had made St and Greavsie so special was reaching its final days. When the programme ended, most people thought they were saying goodbye to a football show. In reality, they were saying goodbye to football's golden age. Subscribe, because some football stories deserve to be remembered. Long before television made them famous, Jimmy Greaves and Ian St John were already football heroes, but they couldn't have been more different. Jimmy Greaves was a genius. Goals came naturally to him. While other strikers fought for chances, Greaves simply seemed to know where the ball would land. Chelsea supporters loved him, defenders feared him, and before long the rest of England did too. By his early 20s, he had become one of the deadliest goalscorers in Europe. Goals followed him everywhere he went. Chelsea, Tottenham, England. By the time his career ended, he had scored hundreds of top-flight goals and established himself as one of the greatest finishers football had ever seen. Ian St John took a different path. He wasn't football's golden boy, he was football's fighter, strong, determined, relentless. Those qualities earned him a move to Liverpool. There, under Bill Shankly, he became one of the key figures behind Liverpool's rise from second division football to one of England's emerging powers. Then came 1965, the FA Cup final, extra time, one decisive moment. St John scored the winner. Liverpool had won their first FA Cup and his place in football history was secure. By the end of the 1960s, both men were household names. They had won trophies, scored famous goals, and built legendary careers. But football never stops moving. Eventually, every player reaches the same destination. Retirement, the crowds disappear, the stadium lights fade, and a new question begins. What happens next? For most footballers, the story ends there. For Jimmy Greaves and Ian St John, the most unexpected chapter was still to come. By the early 1980s, football had a problem. The game was still popular, but its image wasn't. Crowd trouble, poor stadiums, negative headlines. Football was struggling to connect with the wider public. Television coverage wasn't helping either. Most football programs felt serious, formal, predictable. The presenters talked to viewers. St and Greavsie talked with them, and that made all the difference. When ITV brought Jimmy Greaves and Ian St John together, nobody expected magic. They were simply two retired footballers. No broadcasting backgrounds, no media training, no grand plan. Yet almost immediately, something clicked. Their chemistry felt effortless. Greaves was the entertainer, always ready with a joke, always ready with a story. St John was the perfect partner, quick-witted, sharp, and never afraid to fire one back. The result felt completely different from anything football television had seen before. Supporters weren't watching experts, they were watching football fans. Fans who happened to have played at the highest level. Week after week, audiences grew. Millions began tuning in, not because they needed football results, but because they enjoyed spending time with St and Greavsie. The pair turned football into something warm, something familiar, something fun. Without realizing it, they had helped change football television forever. Long before modern ex-players filled television studios, St and Greavsie had shown broadcasters that football analysis could be entertaining as well as informative. And before long, St and Greavsie had become far more than a football show. It had become part of Saturday morning itself. As the years passed, St and Greavsie became one of Britain's most popular football programmes. What started as a football show quickly became something much bigger. People came for the goals, but they stayed for the personalities. Jimmy Greaves and Ian St John felt different. They weren't polished, they weren't scripted, and that was exactly why people loved them. You never knew what would happen next. One moment they were discussing football, the next they were laughing through complete chaos. The show produced countless memorable moments. There were celebrity guests, bizarre segments, and enough football madness to keep supporters entertained every week. One of the strangest came when a New York businessman named Donald Trump appeared to conduct a cup draw. It sounded ridiculous, because it was. Yet somehow, it became one of the show's most memorable moments. Then came Christmas 1990. When Jimmy Greaves was unable to appear, the program replaced him with his spitting image puppet. It was completely absurd, and viewers loved it. That was the magic of St and Greavsie. It never took itself too seriously. seriously. Football was important, but it was also supposed to be fun. Soon, celebrities and sporting stars were appearing on the show, and by the end of the 1980s, Saint and Greavsie were more than former footballers. They had become national television stars, the faces of Saturday mornings, and the voice of football's golden age. But beyond the laughter, football itself was beginning to change. For years, it seemed as if Saint and Greavsie would last forever. The audience was strong, the chemistry was still there, and supporters loved every minute of it. But football was changing, slowly at first, then all at once. Television money was growing, sponsors were becoming more powerful, and the game was starting to think bigger than ever before. The football of the 1980s had been built around local communities. The football of the 1990s was beginning to target the entire world. The change wasn't obvious at first. Most supporters still packed the terraces. Most fans still spent their Saturdays the same way. But behind the scenes, a revolution was underway. The people running football wanted something new, a new image, a new audience, a new future. And that future was getting closer with every passing season. Saint and Greavsie had become the symbols of football's old world, a world built on personality, humour, and ordinary supporters. But the game was moving in a different direction, one driven by television deals and commercial ambition. The golden age wasn't ending with a bang, it was quietly slipping away, and soon a single decision would change football forever. In 1992, English football entered a new era. The Premier League was born. For many supporters, it felt like an exciting new beginning. Bigger clubs, more money, greater exposure, a brighter future. But every new era comes with a price. The Premier League's television rights were awarded to Sky, and with that decision, football broadcasting changed forever. Suddenly, the game looked different, it sounded different, and it was being sold differently. Football was no longer just a national sport, it was becoming a global product. For Saint and Greavsie, the consequences were devastating. The programme's success had been built around ITV's football coverage. Without those rights, its future became uncertain, and before long, the decision was made. After nearly a decade on television, Saint and Greavsie was coming to an end. Not because viewers had stopped watching, not because Saint and Greavsie had lost their magic, but because the football world around them had changed. The programme belonged to one era. Football was entering another, and there was no place for the old world in the new one. For the first time, it became clear that this wasn't simply the end of a television show. It was the end of something much bigger, the end of the football culture that had created it. On paper, it was just another television episode, one final broadcast, one final sign-off, one final Saturday morning with Saint and Greavsie. But for those who watched it, it felt different. The laughter was still there, the jokes were still there, yet something had changed. An era was ending. For years, Jimmy Greaves and Ian St. John had been part of football fans' weekly routine. They had celebrated the highs, laughed at the madness, and reminded supporters why they loved the game. Now it was time to say goodbye. As the programme came to a close, Saint and Greavsie delivered one final farewell. No dramatic speeches, no grand declarations, just two old friends leaving the stage together. It was simple, it was honest, and somehow that made it even more emotional. Most viewers believed they were watching the end of a football show. What they didn't realise was that they were witnessing the final chapter of an entire football age. The terraces were disappearing, the game was becoming bigger, richer, more commercial, and the football world that Saint and Greavsie represented was slowly fading into history. The show was over, but the feeling it represented would never truly return. Looking back today, it's easy to see why Saint and Greavsie is still remembered. It wasn't just a football show, it was a snapshot of a different football world. A world where the game felt closer to the supporters, where players seemed more human, and where football hadn't yet become a billion-pound industry. That era wasn't perfect, but for many fans, it felt real. And that's what Saint and Greavsie captured so well. Every joke, every story, every laugh. It came from two men who genuinely loved the game. That's why people still remember them today. Not because of flashy production, not because of expert analysis, but because they brought something football television rarely has: heart. They reminded supporters that football was supposed to be fun, and perhaps that's why their story still resonates decades later. Because many fans aren't just nostalgic for a television show, they're nostalgic for the football world that came with it. Jimmy Greaves and Ian St. John started as footballers. They became television stars, and somehow they became the faces of football's final old age. Their programme didn't end because people stopped loving it. It ended because football changed. Bigger, richer, more commercial. But further away from the world that had made Saint and Greavsie so special. The goals remain, the laughter remains, and the memories remain. A reminder of a time when football felt simpler, closer, more human. Because when Saint and Greavsie disappeared from television, it wasn't just the end of a show. It was the end of football's golden age. And if you enjoyed this story, Make sure to subscribe for more football legends, forgotten eras, and the stories that shaped the beautiful game.